September 15th, 1916. No Man's Land, Flers-Courcelette, France. The crew of a Mark I tank, codenamed Dinnaken, heard the rounds before they felt them. German machine gun fire hammered the hull at close range, and the steel, 6 millimeters of it on the sides, barely more than a car door, transmitted every impact directly into the crew compartment as a shower of molten metal flakes, tiny fragments spalled from the inner face of the plate by rounds that didn't even penetrate. Men went blind. Men burned. The tank kept moving. Barely. 49 Mark I tanks crossed the line that morning in the first armored assault in the history of warfare. The theory was sound. A steel vehicle impervious to small arms fire, crossing wire, crushing trenches, breaking the deadlock that had killed hundreds of thousands in 2 years of futile infantry advance. The reality was different. Fewer than a third reached their objectives. Mechanical breakdown claimed some. German field guns destroyed others at close range. But a quieter, more troubling failure ran through every engagement report filed that evening. The armor wasn't hard enough. Rifle-calibre rounds fired at close range were punching through side plates. Armour-piercing bullets were defeating steel that was supposed to stop them. Inside those metal boxes, in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, breathing cordite fumes and petrol vapor, crews were dying not from artillery, but from a metallurgical problem nobody had fully solved before sending them into battle. The British Army had invented the tank. It had not yet invented the steel to make it survivable. 200 miles north, in the furnace rooms and forge halls of Sheffield, that problem was already being worked. The answer wasn't coming from a government laboratory or a War Office committee. It was coming from men who had been building the hardest steel in the world for 50 years and were about to build something harder still. Sheffield had been making the hardest steel in the world since before anyone thought to put it on a battlefield. By the 1860s, the city's East End was a continuous roar of tilt hammers and crucible furnaces, a skyline of smoke and flame visible from 20 miles away on clear nights. The River Don ran orange some mornings for mill effluent. The air tasted of sulfur. Sheffield didn't apologize for any of it. It was the steel capital of the world, and it knew exactly what that meant. The firms that would eventually merge into Sheffield Forgemasters carried lineages that read like a Victorian industrial biography. Thomas Firth and Sons had been rolling armor plate for the Royal Navy since the 1850s, supplying the iron cladding that armored HMS Warrior, Britain's first iron-hulled warship, in 1861. Naylor Vickers, operating from the Cyclops Works on Brightside Lane, had forged naval gun barrels and propeller shafts of a scale no other British producer could match. By the 1880s, Sheffield steel was on every major Royal Navy capital ship afloat. The firms understood hardness, understood tensile strength, understood what happened to steel under catastrophic impact loading at sea. What they had not built was armor for something that moved across land under its own power, turned corners, crossed ditches, and required its crew to survive inside it. Naval armor was thick, static, and designed to absorb and deflect large caliber shells at range. Vehicle armor needed to be hard enough to defeat rifle-calibre rounds at close range, tough enough not to shatter under repeated impact, light enough that a tracked vehicle could carry it without sinking into French mud, and manufacturable in large, flat, consistent plates that could be cut, shaped, and bolted together in a factory. Sheffield had the furnaces. It had the craft. It did not yet have the specification. That was about to change. In the autumn of 1914, the British War Office understood it had a steel problem, but did not yet understand how serious that problem was. Military steel doctrine had been built entirely around the Navy. Battleships needed armor that was enormously thick, cemented on its face to shatter incoming shells, and backed by softer steel to absorb the shock. Nobody had written a specification for armor that needed to be 30 millimeters thick instead of 300, mounted on a vehicle weighing 30 tons instead of 30,000, and proof against a rifle bullet at 50 yards rather than a naval shell at 5 miles. The two problems were not even cousins. They were entirely different questions wearing the same name. Germany had been asking the right question longer. Krupp's works at Essen had been developing vehicle-grade steel since before the war began. Driven partly by early German interest in motorized military transport and partly by the sheer industrial momentum of a firm that had never stopped pushing its metallurgy forward. Britain had no equivalent program. What Britain had, in late 1914, was an emergency. The War Office issued urgent specifications and sent them to the firms most likely to answer. Sheffield Forgemasters, Hadfields, and Camel Laird all received the brief. The requirement was blunt. Produce a steel plate hard enough to stop a standard rifle round fired at close range. Make it tough enough not to crack under repeated hits. Keep it light enough to be practical. Deliver it in large quantities. Do it fast. 3 Sheffield firms now worked the same problem under wartime secrecy in parallel, with no guarantee any of them would solve it first or solve it at all. The furnaces were already hot. The question was whether the steel coming out of them would be good enough. So far it wasn't. The answer was in the chemistry, and Sheffield's metallurgists knew it before they could prove it. Nickel strengthened steel's internal grain structure, resisting deformation under impact. Chromium hardened the surface, creating a face that would shatter an incoming round rather than absorb it. But the ratio mattered enormously, and the heat treatment mattered more than either. Rolled steel plate heated to precise temperatures, then water quenched rapidly to lock its crystalline structure, then tempered at lower heat to relieve the brittleness that quenching introduced, produced something categorically different from anything Sheffield had rolled before. Hard enough on its face to break a bullet, tough enough in its body not to crack under the next one. The specification that emerged from this process became known as Rolled Homogeneous Armor, RHA, a name that would echo through every tank program, every armor test, every military specification written anywhere in the world for the next 100 years. Scaling it from a laboratory heat to industrial production was a different problem entirely. Sheffield Forgemasters operated presses capable of exerting 10,000 tons of force, rolling mills that could produce consistent plate, thickness across surfaces measured in square meters. The physical infrastructure existed nowhere else in Britain, but consistency was the challenge. A plate that passed proof testing on a Monday could fail on a Friday. If the heat treatment cycle drifted by 20 degrees, every batch was proof tested by firing at it. Plates that cracked failed. Plates that deformed without cracking passed. The rejection rate in early 1915 was brutally high. By late 1915, it was falling. By mid-1916, Sheffield was rolling RHA plate to specification in industrial quantities. The Mark I tanks that crossed at Flers-Courcelette carried early-grade plate. The Mark IV tanks arriving in 1917 carried Sheffield RHA. The crews who climbed into Mark IVs had a measurably better chance of climbing back out. November 20th, 1917, Cambrai, France. At 6:20 in the morning, 476 tanks moved forward together across relatively firm ground, preceded by a hurricane artillery bombardment that had been planned in secret to preserve the element of surprise. It was the largest tank assault in history. Sheffield RHA plate was on every hull. By midday, British forces had broken through German lines to a depth of 5 miles, capturing more ground in a single day than the entire Passchendaele offensive had managed in 3 months of fighting and 300,000 casualties. Church bells rang in London for the first time since the war began, but the Germans were learning too. Captured examples of British armor plate had been analyzed, tested, and answered. The German army had issued its infantry a new round, the Stahlkern cartridge, an armor-piercing bullet with a hardened steel core capable of defeating Mark IV side armor at combat ranges below 100 meters. After Cambrai, after-action reports documented penetrations through plates that should have held. The armor that had represented a breakthrough in 1916 was already being outpaced by 1917. This was not a failure of Sheffield's steel. It was the opening of a race that would never fully close. Sheffield's response was to develop thicker plate grades, higher specification alloys, and the metallurgical research programs that would produce the armor steel variants used in Matilda and Churchill tanks a generation later. By November 11, 1918, Britain had produced more than 2,500 tanks. Every hull was plated to Sheffield's specification. The 100 Days Offensive, the sustained combined arms assault that finally broke the German army from August to November 1918, placed tanks at the center of every major advance. They moved. They held together. Their crews survived engagements that would have killed the men inside a Mark I 2 years earlier. Sheffield plate had made the difference, quietly and without ceremony, one rolled slab at a time. Sheffield did not stop when the guns did. The same firms, the same furnaces, the same accumulated metallurgical knowledge that had solved Britain's 1915 armor problem were already being directed at the next one, before the ink dried on the armistice. The interwar years produced refinements in alloy composition and heat treatment that the wartime emergency had never allowed time to perfect. When Germany reappeared as a threat in the late 1930s, Sheffield was ready in a way it had not been in 1914. Churchill tank armor, Valentine hulls, the plating on Matilda infantry tanks that proved resistant enough to stop most German anti-tank weapons during the early North African campaign. All of it traced its metallurgical lineage directly back to the RHA specification. Sheffield had developed under emergency conditions a generation earlier. The Second War confirmed what the First had proved. Britain's armored capacity rested on a foundation of Sheffield steel. The post-war decades brought different demands, but the same essential requirement. Things that needed to be stronger than anything else available, manufactured at a scale and precision that eliminated the possibility of failure. Sheffield. Forgemasters produced naval gun forgings for the Cold War fleet, pressure vessels for Britain's civil nuclear program, and components for the Vanguard-class submarine program that carry Britain's nuclear deterrent to this day. In 2020, the British government acquired a majority stake in Sheffield Forgemasters, specifically to preserve a national defense manufacturing capability that existed nowhere else in the country. The official assessment was unambiguous. Certain forgings required for nuclear submarine construction could not be sourced from any other domestic supplier. The strategic logic was identical to 1915. When the capability doesn't exist, you build it. When it exists, you protect it. The RHA specification. Sheffield forged under wartime pressure became the universal benchmark against which every armor steel developed anywhere in the world was subsequently measured. Soviet. T-34 armor. American Sherman plate. German Panzer IV steel. All of it evaluated, compared, and classified in RHA equivalents. Sheffield had not merely solved a British problem. It had established the global standard by which armor itself was defined for the remainder of the 20th century. That standard did not emerge from a government laboratory or a university research program. It came from men who had spent their lives reading the color of molten steel in a furnace, who understood heat treatment not from a textbook, but from decades of watching what happened when they got it wrong. It came from a city that had been building the hardest things in the world since before anyone asked it to. When Britain needed armor that didn't exist, Sheffield didn't wait for someone else to invent it. It went back to the furnace, worked the problem, and rolled the answer out in plates that men staked their lives on. Some of those men came home because of what Sheffield made. Most of them never knew it. The men who climbed into Mark I tanks on the Somme in September 1916 did so in steel. That wasn't ready. Sheffield made it ready. The furnaces were already burning when those men went over the top. The answer was in the fire. It just needed time to be forged.